Days are filled with sorrow and care, hearts are lonely and drear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Good morning. Beautiful Friday morning. I got a nice shower early this morning. We needed rain a lot, so that was really nice to wake up to this morning. A little thunder and rain shower, and just felt refreshing to hear that sound. I hope you're having a great week this week. You know, we look around and things, if we allow ourselves to feel this way, it feels really heavy. And whether we allow ourselves to or not, there are a lot of things right now that are just, that seem to be heavy in the world around us and the communities around us. And it just gets really hard as we focus on those things and talk about those things. But the reality is, hardness, difficult things are a part of life. We've all endured something very hard at some point in our life, as many of us, as many people are right now. And even including the Apostle Paul, he was not exempt from that. And we read Scripture, we see time and time again that he faced hardship and struggle and things. In fact, he describes some of the hardships that he endured in Asia in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. He says, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. And notice the first part of that verse, verse 8, where Paul says, "For we would not have you uninformed," or ignorant, as some translations say, of the trouble which came to us in Asia. The word trouble is the Greek word thalipsis, which is used to convey the idea of a heavy pressure situation. In fact, at one point, this word was even used to depict a victim who was first tied up with rope, bound with rope and laid on his back, and then a huge heavy boulder was slowly lowered upon him until he was crushed. It was very awful, very, very terrible feeling, very, very terrible way to die. And it would be obviously a very heavy situation for the man underneath that boulder, because he would be in a tight place under heavy burden, in a great squeeze. It's just an awful, awful, awful feeling. But you can imagine when Paul used that word, what images that brought to people's mind, the reader's mind, as he used that. But by using that word, Paul is saying that we were under a heavy load, an unbelievably a heavy amount of stress and pressure. He was describing this stress they were under. We were in very tight circumstances. Our minds were being squeezed. It felt like our very lives were being pushed right out of us. So whatever they were going through in the province of Asia was very, very heavy for them. You know, a person can live with pain in his body if his mind is still in control. But however, when the suffering begins to work on the person's mind, then both his body and both his body and his mind, would eventually break and fold. It gets really hard. You might think that Paul is referring to physical suffering. Of course, physical suffering is difficult, but the greatest suffering of all always occurs in the mind. A mental suffering is much, much more difficult to deal with and to endure. And it seems as though Paul's greatest suffering was not physical, but mental. And he goes on to say, we were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, that we despaired of life itself. That's a tremendous amount of suffering. It's a tremendous amount of mental pressure. And that first phrase where he says that we were under great pressure, This is the Greek phrase, kath huper, hyperbole. If I'm pronouncing that right, and I may have just butchered it, I don't know. Nevertheless, that Greek word is extremely important in Paul's testimony. It literally means to throw beyond, to excel, to exceed, or to go beyond anything normal or expected. It also describes something that is excessive and beyond the normal range of what most would experience. So it's something very big, something very, very, very heavy. And by using this word, Paul says we were under an amount of pressure that is not normal. It was far beyond anything we'd ever previously experienced. It was excessive. It was unbelievable. It was unbearable, and far too much for any human being to endure. And Paul goes on to tell us that this pressure was above strength, beyond their ability to endure. And this word for beyond or above is also important. It's the Greek word hooper, which also conveys the idea of something excessive. And so in order to explain how bad his situation was, Paul is just piling words on top of words. And all of them accurately portray how terrifically bad the ordeal in Asia was for him and his traveling companions. It's almost as though Paul's saying normal human strength would never have been enough for this situation they were in. The strength it required was far, far beyond human strength. This predicament required strength in a measure that Paul was saying that I had never previously needed. It was beyond me. Then Paul says, it was so bad that we despaired of life itself. The word for despaired is the word exaporeomai, and it was used in a technical sense to describe no way out. It's where we get our word for exasperated. Describes people who feel trapped, who feel caught or up against a wall or pinned down and utterly hopeless. And today we might even say something like, sorry, it looks like the end of the road for you. That's where Paul was. He continues in verse 9, and even says, but we had the sentence of death on ourselves. And the word sentence there meaning the final verdict, essentially. He was saying it looked like the verdict was in. We were not going to survive. And so when all these difficult phrases and words are put together and looked at together, it becomes very plain that Paul's primary suffering was a very mental suffering, not so much a physical suffering. He's describing mental agony. He's describing agony on a measure that few of us have ever experienced. Some of you may have. But all of these Greek words put together, we could read it this way. Something like this that says, we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of the horribly tight, life-threatening squeeze that came to us in Asia. It was unbelievable. With all the things that we had been through, this was the worst of all. It felt like our lives were being crushed. It was so difficult that I didn't know what to do. No experience I've ever been through required so much of me. In fact, I didn't have enough strength to cope with it. Toward the end of this ordeal, I was so overwhelmed that I didn't think we'd ever get out of it. I felt suffocated, trapped, pinned against the wall. I really thought it was the end of the road for us. As far as we were concerned, the verdict was in, and the verdict said death. But really, this was no great shock because we were already feeling the effect of death and depression in our souls. And Paul doesn't tell us exactly what happened to him and his traveling companions when they were in Asia, but whatever it was the most grueling experience they had ever been through until that time. You may ask, well, why would Paul want us to know that he had been through such difficult times? Did he want us to feel sorry for him? I don't think that's it. Paul wanted us to know that everyone endures hardness from time to time. Every one of us deals with difficulty. Even the greatest and most well-known, celebrated spiritual leaders are confronted with situations that can be devastating and challenging. And even with all of his knowledge and revelation experience, Paul himself, the great apostle, was assaulted by Satan. It was so aggressive that Paul wrote, we despaired even of life. And describing these intense emotions he felt as he went through these extremely difficult circumstances. Satan's prowling around like a roaring lion, and he wants to attack us and assault us and make us have doubt and all of those things. Paul didn't break. He didn't even die. And likewise, if you and I will hold on, and if we'll fight right where we are, and hold on to God and His promises of deliverance, then you and I won't break or be destroyed either. And like Paul, you and I will win the victory. Not because of anything we did. We'll win because God wins the victory. We'll be able to say that the ordeal happened in order that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raised the dead, 2 Corinthians 17. God's delivering power it's yours and it's mine. He promises us that. He rescued us in the past. He will rescue you and rescue you again in the future. All He asks is that you and I stay put right where He called us to be. Stay the course. Continue to hold on to Him. Continue to believe and have faith in His promises. And to let Him carry our burdens. I know things can be very, very heavy. I know things can be very hard. But God says I'm big enough. I'm a big enough God to handle all of those things that burden you, that weigh you down, that make you feel caught, that make you feel trapped. If you'll just hand them over to me. He says, take my yoke upon you, for my burden is easy and light. And so I want to encourage you to do that. I hope you find this encouraging today. And maybe you've got some burdens that are really, really heavy, and it's time for you to hand those burdens over to God. And let the God who's big enough to handle them, in fact, handle them. Love you guys. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.